We mentioned cookies and sessions briefly back when we talked about the flash hash, because Rails uses the session to store the flash hash values between requests. Now let's get a closer look at them. One of the challenges of building web applications is the web is inherently a stateless environment. That means that when web servers respond to requests for pages, each request is treated as a brand new request, and the web server doesn't know, keep track of, or care about what previous requests have been made. It doesn't know what a user has selected in the past or what they've clicked on. It doesn't know if the user's logged in or not. And that's where cookies come in. Cookies help us to solve the problem of the stateless web. A web server can place a cookie file on the user's browser and store data in it, our state. With each request to that web server, the browser will send along that cookie file. A cookie might track what the user last clicked on, or it might include the user's location, language preferences, or search settings. And this allows us as developers then to be able to maintain the state of a user's interaction with our site. But cookies have two limitations you need to be aware of. The first is that they have a maximum size of 4K. That's equal to about 4,096 characters. That's not a small amount of characters if we're just storing text. But if we start storing things like objects in it, then very quickly we start getting over 4K. So we want to keep the data that we store in there very slim. The second thing is to be aware of the fact that these cookies reside on the user's computer. So the user can delete the cookies, and the user can also read them and potentially alter their values. Now, in a lot of cases, if we're just storing the fact that the user prefers to use English as their default language, it's no big deal if they alter it to be something else. But if we are going to store something that has a little bit more security importance, then you'd want to be aware of this and either encrypt the data or handle it differently. Now, Rails makes using cookies very simple. It works just like the params do. We have this master hash called cookies, and in it are all the names of the cookies that we want to work with, the cookies that we've stored. So cookies username equals, and then whatever value we want, that sets the cookie for us. Rails takes care of everything behind the scenes to make sure that that cookie gets sent to the user's browser. On the next request, if we want to retrieve that value, then we just say cookies in square brackets :username, and it returns the value to us. The second example is just show you the syntax there. If you need to specify a time that a cookie will expire, you can do it this way. Now, in addition to cookies, there's another alternative called sessions. And sessions were developed as a way to overcome the two limitations of cookies, to allow more data to be stored and to store it on the server so that its contents can't be read or altered. The way it works is the server still sets a cookie on the user's browser, but instead of storing any data in that cookie, it stores an ID that references a session file stored somewhere else. That somewhere else might be a file on the server file system or an entry in a database table. Now, sessions do have some limitations of their own. First of all, it requires some extra time to retrieve that session file for each request. So we either have to go to the file system and find the file and read it, or we have to go to a database and look it up. Now, because that's happening for each and every request, that's not an insignificant consideration. The second problem is that old session files accumulate. So a user comes to our site one time and then they never come back and visit again. We've still got their session files sitting around, either in our file system or in our database, just gathering dust. We've then got to make sure that we write some kind of housekeeping code that will go through and clean up and delete old session files that are older than a certain date, for example. And sessions do still have the problem that they use cookies. So there's still a file that resides on the user's computer, which means that that file can be deleted, and that means the reference to the session file would be deleted. And it also means that the cookie file could be hijacked. That is, if a user could alter the reference ID to the session file, they could hijack someone else's session file and act as if that session file was their own. Now, that's not super easy to do because the IDs for these session files are very long, but it is something to be aware of. The way that you actually use sessions is just as easy as using cookies. Session, and then square brackets, :username, and then whatever data we want to store in the session. Now, even though sessions don't have a 4K limit, you really want to be very conservative about what you store in them. For example, you want to store IDs that reference objects, not the objects themselves. You don't want to store an entire product, let's say. You want to put an ID for that product into the session. If a user logs in, you don't want to store the entire user object in the session. Not only is it large, but the data may become stale over time. Instead, we want to just have a reference to it by storing the ID, and then we can go look it up and get a fresh copy from the database when we need it. Now let's talk about the session storage options. Now, the first option is file storage, and that was the default in Rails version 1, but it's pretty much extinct now because it's slow, takes a long time to read things from the file system, it does not scale well. Once we start having large websites where there's multiple web servers responding to web requests, then it's almost impossible to share those session files between those different servers. and we still have the problem of those files that accumulate over time and bloat up our file system until finally we run out of disk space. The second option is still available as an option, and that's database storage. Now this isn't slow, but it's not fast either. It requires an additional database call to go to the database and find that session in the database file. And then instead of file system bloat, we end up with database bloat from those leftover sessions, and our database begins to fill up and slow down. Now there's a third option, and it's a very peculiar option, and that is cookie storage. And that's what, starting in Rails version 2, and also in Rails version 3, became the default option. And the idea is that instead of storing the session file on the server somewhere where it takes a long time, what if we just made the cookie into a sort of super cookie, and we put the session in there? So it actually is no longer a session file the way that the other ones work, where we just have an ID in the cookie, and then we reference a file somewhere else. Instead, let's go ahead and put the data in the cookie. But when we do that, we'll take the extra step of encrypting the data so that we make sure that the user can't tamper with it, and then we also eliminate the possibility that they can hijack someone else's session, because someone else's session lives in their cookie on their computer. We do have the 4K maximum size limit, but if we're following good practices and we're only storing things like IDs in there, then that's really not a problem. We also get the bonus that there's no bloat to either our file system or our database, and most of all, it's extremely fast. This is the fastest way for the browser to deliver this configuration data to our application so that we can use it. Now there are some other possibilities for ways that you would store this, but these are the main ones, and really you want to just stick with the default cookie storage unless you know that you need something different. Let's take a look at our application so I can show you a few places where we can set some configuration options. There are two configuration files that we're interested in. They're both inside the config folder and inside the initializers folder. The first is secrettoken.rb and the second is session.store.rb. Let's start with session store. This is the place where you can configure which one of those storage options that you want to use. And as you can see, by default, it's going to be using cookie store. You can also see down here in the comments that it gives you some helpful hints on how to go about using active record store, which is sort of the other popular option. Cookie store is preferred. I think you should try and stick with that. But if you want to store it in your database, then you would use active record store. And the most important part of the helpful hint that they give you is this rake command here. This rake command will generate a migration for you that has everything you need for your sessions table. You don't have to worry about what the sessions table should look like. You just type rake db sessions create from the command line in the root of your Rails application, and it'll create the migration for you. Now you still have to run that migration. So right after you do that command, you'll do rake db migrate. Then you'll have your table in your database, and all you have to do is change the configuration to use active record store, and you'll be off and running. You can also see that you can set the key up here for the session store. That's going to be the name of the cookie that will be set in the user's browser. When we first generated our app, it defaulted to be an underscore, followed by our application name, followed by underscore session. But you can change that to be something else if you like. Let me show you what I mean. I'll go into Firefox here. And under Firefox in Preferences, under Privacy, I have the option to go to Use Custom Settings for History and then Show Cookies. Now, all browsers do this a little bit differently, and they hide it away in the preferences in a different place, but I think if you hunt around, you'll be able to find out where the cookies are located. Usually it's under Privacy or Security or something like that. In my cookies, if you see I have localhost. If I open that up, localhost is my local development machine. Here's the cookie, Simple CMS Session. If I click on that cookie, see it tells me the name of it is Simple CMS Session, and the content is this long string that just keeps on going here. That is the encrypted content of my session that's inside that cookie. So this is the name of the cookie, and this is its content. Okay, now let's go back to our application again. Let's take a look now at secrettoken.rb. This is the string that Rails will use to help when encrypting the content in that cookie file. When I initially generated my Rails app, it also populated this value with a unique string. And if you ever want another one, all you have to do is go into your command line, and from the root of your Rails app, type rake secret. It'll take a second, and it'll come back with a long string like this that's a random value that you can use in there. Just be aware that if you swap this value in place of this one, that any sessions that have already been created will no longer be able to be decrypted using the new value because they were encrypted with the old one. So it's just something to be aware of. Now that we've seen where we can configure our sessions, let's actually put them to use. Let's go into our controller, and I'm actually going to go into Access Controller. If you scroll down here into the attempt login, you'll see that I have a comment to do mark user as logged in. And that's a placeholder for the code that will actually mark the user as logged in. So what I want to do instead here is use my sessions. Session, and then inside the session, I'm going to have a key called user_ID, and I'm going to set it equal to, and I'll just copy this authorized user and paste it down here, and I want the ID of that person. So if we have a person, then set the session user ID equal to this user's ID. Then on the next line, let's do session username is going to be equal to authorized user.username. Now I have the ID stored in the session, so I can look up the user if I need to, and the fact that they have an ID at all will let me know that the user did authenticate and therefore is logged in. It's their hand stamp. The username I'm storing just so that I won't have to make another trip back to the database to find out this user's name. Their username is a simple piece of information that's not going to change very often, but that I might want to use a lot, such as at the top of every page. So I'm going to store it here for convenience. And then down here, in the logout action, I'll just copy these two lines, and in place of this to-do comment, I'm going to paste those in, but instead of setting them equal to the ID, I'm going to set them both equal to nil. Essentially what I'm doing is taking away their hand stamp, which is that user ID that's stored in the session. If they have the user ID, they are logged in. If they don't, then we want to send them back to the login page. Now in the next movie, we need to write the code that will perform that check to see whether or not a user has a user ID set and therefore has been successfully authenticated.